Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Henriette Lazaridis.
Hi there, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Molly. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on.
This is great. Can't wait to talk about Terra Nova.
Yeah, actually, it's my first question. Can you tell me a bit about Terra Nova as well as your other book and just your writing in general?
Well, so I realized that my two books seemingly have nothing in common because Terra Nova is set in Antarctica and in London and in 1910, so it's a historical novel. And The Clover House is a sort of contemporary novel set mostly in Greece, but pretty contemporary. It's a sort of personal story of one person's family situation, and Terra Nova is this big adventure story and has some historical and political stuff in it. But I think both books, in some way, I'm trying to explore sort of questions of authenticity. And with The Clover House, it's sort of this young woman who's trying to figure out how to be authentic to herself and trying to figure out her cultural identity. And with Terra Nova, I've got these two explorers who are, I don't know if I should spoil anything, but just I can say that their actions call into question the authenticity of what they're doing and have done. And then Viola, the wife of one explorer who is also the lover of the other, back in London, who is trying to do stuff for the suffrage movement, she's also reckoning with this question of authenticity in her art and in her own kind of political engagement too.
Yeah. As I was saying to you before we got on the show, I've been reading Terra Nova, and it is so stunning. And I think part of the reason why I love it so much is those questions of authenticity and like wondering where the characters are coming from, and you're on this emotional journey with them of like how they can move forward. My favorite sections though were the parts with Viola and talking about the suffrage movement. How did that come into play in this novel?
Well, it kind of came in, it was one of the first and then last elements for me to think about. I knew I started the novel writing the men's story in Antarctica. So literally every day in the morning, in the dark, I started the novel in December many years ago, and I would write in the dark, and I was pushing these men across the Antarctic ice little by little. And I finished their story. And then I always knew there would be a Viola, and that she would be a photographer, and that she would be the wife of one explorer and the lover of the other, blah, blah, blah. At first, in my notes early on, I asked myself the question, should she be involved in the suffrage movement? And then you can see the place where I say, no, I don't want to do that. And then I tried all these other things for her, other ways for her to be involved in her art. And of course, the suffrage movement was happening right then in 1910 when I set the story. So it seemed almost silly to have her not engaging. And I wanted her to be someone who, at first, she has a complicated interaction with the suffrage movement because her husband has said, hey, I don't want you going on these marches. Before they're married, he's proud that she does this. And when they're married, he changes his mind because he wants her to be safe. And she is pregnant, then she has a miscarriage. So there's this whole history behind or before the story of her being kept from participating. But it made so much sense for her to be participating as an artist, because this is her exploration. The men are doing their thing in Antarctica, but she's doing hers with her art and politically struggling for independence back in London.
Where did the initial hesitancy come in having that be a part of her story?
I think if I look at my notes, I think what I said to myself was, no, that would be too on the nose. It felt like it would be too obviously connected to, oh yeah, the men are doing their exploration. She too is fighting for her own independence. And I think what I really should have thought at the time was, yeah, it'll seem on the nose if you do it badly. But if you really work hard at it and you make it nuanced and complicated, then it won't be on the nose. It'll just be part and parcel of the historical world that the character finds herself in, and it will make every bit of sense in the world.
And
So,
it absolutely did.
oh, good. Well, I was going to say, hopefully it did. um,
Yeah, I love the perspective you took from that. And actually the perspective throughout the book was very important. Like when they're on their mission and there's this race also happening with it. And here like it's so it isn't just them taking this expedition. There is this invisible threat throughout it. And how with Viola we've got her trying to reckon with her own thoughts about this and her husband's beliefs, and it's she's in the movement, but for most of it, at least without giving away too much, she's kind of an observer in it.
right. Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, but she hasn't been a complete diehard suffragette, and that was it's not a scornful term. That's what they were called, suffragette. But she hasn't been a diehard from the very beginning. She has been observing, but then when she starts to learn more about it, she starts to even think like, well, hold on a second. There's this thing called the Artists' Suffrage League, which was a real historical thing of artists who got together and they painted posters and they designed banners and they did art around their claim for the right to vote. And her initial reaction is, really? Is this all we're going to do? We're going to sew banners? I want to do something bigger than that. But part of it, too, for her is, yes, she's thinking about suffrage and how to make a bigger push, but she's also thinking about her ambitions as an artist. And I think she's thinking, if all I do is sew banners, that's not going to get me anywhere as an artist. It might not even get us anywhere as suffragettes, but it's certainly not going to get me anywhere as an artist. And so there's that too. She's not completely sincere.
Mm-hmm.
She's got some other stuff. She's got some ulterior motives.
It brings back the authenticity part of it.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, and she gets challenged on that by others, and sort of are you an authentic suffragette? You have inserted yourself in this movement. Are you like the rest of us? Do you deserve to call yourself by this label like the rest of us? Are you really working as hard at this and as sincerely as we are?
Especially through, once again, I'm trying not to spoil, but through chapters where you look into more specific parts of the movement and people that are truly on the front lines of this compared to where she is.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question is sometimes, I think about about war correspondents and photojournalists, war photographers who have to take the picture rather than help the person. And, that's a stance that of necessity, a photojournalist in a war setting takes that stance. So, but would you say, okay, you've put your art, your journalism in this case, above your human obligation to help another person? And is that okay? And I think we'd say, yeah, it is okay because you have to get the picture. You have to, that's important too. But that's another question, I think, for Viola, that I hope her character kind of introduces into the story.
Oh, definitely. So what was the research process for this book like, especially compared to, as you're talking about your other book, how it's contemporary? Was there any difference in that process?
Yeah, for the Clover House, there were sections that took place during the Second World War, and I did have to check on certain details, although I grew up with stories from my parents telling me stories of the Second World War in Greece, where both of them, before they met when they were children, were occupied by the Germans and the Italians. But for the Antarctica stuff, weirdly, I also grew up kind of always reading about Scott and always paying attention to Antarctica. Ever since when I was 7 years old, I saw a PBS documentary about Robert Scott. I know I was 7 because I looked it up and I found it online and I found when it aired on PBS. So I was like, oh, okay, I was 7. And I was always fascinated by him. And so it was kind of in the air that I breathed, all this stuff about Antarctica. That kind of research, I stopped. As soon as I began writing the novel, I didn't go near any of the materials from that period because I was terrified that I would borrow inadvertently. And I really didn't want to go there. So I would do things like check hold on, how many miles can a man sledge in an hour? So I'd have to go digging through the journals and stuff to find that information. Or how many calories did they think they needed per hour? The suffrage stuff, I didn't know. And there's plenty of stuff that you can find in archives. Even things like the British Museum has stuff that you can find online. I read some books by suffragettes who had written diaries and journals and things. So I learned what I needed to learn for Viola's story. And it was amazing to me how many things just kind of fell into my lap. Like, I didn't know there was an artist suffrage league. And then it was like, oh, well, perfect. And wouldn't you know, it's down the street from the actual street on which I had Viola and Edward living.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was perfect. So it made, and I put their street, it's a street, actual street in Chelsea in London called Margaretta Terrace. And it's behind, oh my gosh, is it Oakley Avenue? It's where Robert Scott lived.
Oh, that's amazing.
Put them behind. And then the ASL was down the street around the corner. So that was kind of interesting to learn all that kind of stuff.
Had you visited that street or that area or anywhere in London before?
I had. I mean, I lived 4 years in England, 3 in Oxford and 1 in London. But then when I had started writing the novel and I was visiting a friend in London, and we went to, I think it's Beaumont Street. And so I have a picture of the front of Scott's house, and I walked down Margaretta Terrace, and I was like, Jillian, I'm going to put my characters here. This is where they're going to live. So yeah, I did some scoping out.
Oh, that's so cool. Was it your knowledge of Robert Scott that inspired you to write this story? Or did that come about, like, was it something else and then that just sort of happened into it?
Well, so when I was a kid, and I saw this documentary, and I don't think I understood really that he died. I'm not sure, but he was, and I think if I were to find that documentary again now, I think it's kind of, it was very pro Scott, even though he was the loser. But Scott was a great writer, and he left behind these amazingly poetic journals. And so it's easy to like Scott and feel like, yeah, Amundsen, he was first, fine. But Scott is the noble Englishman. And so I kind of I fell right into that. I loved adventure. I loved the snow. I named my golden retriever Scotty after him. Yes.
Awesome.
I was Team Scott. But then at some point, maybe in my 20s, I really was thinking about, like, he got to the South Pole and he found Amundsen's flag already there. I mean, in all that space, just imagine, like, you don't see the other guy for months, but you know he's out there. And then you converge on this place and you find he's beaten you. And I just thought, okay, Scott was noble. Scott, like, wrote letters and journals, and he was like, okay, he's beaten us. This is terrible, but we've tried our best and we must return. He said noble things. What if you didn't respond that way? Like, it's kind of understandable. A person might not respond that way. Mm-hmm. And I just started thinking about what would happen next. What take it from there if you put two people in that situation and something happens that goes awry. I think in my early notes about the novel, when I was trying to figure it out, I think I was thinking, like, is one of them going to kill the other one? What's going to happen? Is only one of them come back? I had all these different permutations of how the story would work out. And then I, settled on the one I settled on.
Mm-hmm. I also love the fact that, at least I could be totally off base and you could not have intended this at all, but in my opinion, the relationship between James and Edward, it mirrors the relationship that they have between this threat moving towards this pole. And it's like there's this enemy there, but they don't know who it is. Like, they don't know where it is, and they don't know how to defeat it, but it's right there the entire time.
Oh, I think that's great, because it makes me think of in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I don't know if you've ever seen, but at one point Paul Newman and Robert Redford are being pursued by people they can actually see. In this case, they can see them. It's a man with a white hat, and it's this beautiful montage where they keep saying, who are those guys? And then they keep moving, and this man in a white hat is pursuing them. So in this way, in the novel, sure, they're not chasing each other, but they kind of also are. Like they're both trying to get to the South Pole first. At one point, we think Heywood has heard their dogs. Like it becomes clear that he may have heard the dogs. But yeah, I wanted to explore that idea of the two men are both rivals with each other, but they desperately need each other. I mean, for survival, but also for, Watts needs Heywood because Heywood's going to help him get his pictures out into the world and make him famous. And Heywood needs Watts because Watts is the photographer and Watts is the man who's going to give him his image. But they also kind of need Jansen, my fictional Norwegian explorer. They need him because without him, they don't have an other to fight against. So I did want to kind of play with those pairs and triangles and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very compelling, that part.
I'm glad.
So kind of pivoting away from the writing process for this book and more of a personal question, has your time teaching, like writing, influenced your own work?
Oh, so much, because I really feel like I learn so much every time I have to teach a craft concept. I'm, of course, reading great craft books and learning from them, and then being like, yes, okay, that makes sense, and then turning around and helping explain these things to my students. And when you're workshopping someone else's pages, which I do in the classes that I teach, we're almost always workshopping pages as part of the way the class is designed. Then I just think anytime that you see someone else dealing with a problem and helping that person figure out how to solve that problem, you're learning how to solve that problem in your own work. So I know that I have benefited from being in the classroom with my students. Totally.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So how did you start writing?
I don't know. I mean, as a kid, I wrote, doesn't everybody like make little newspapers and sell them to their neighbors and stuff?
I did.
Yeah. Like you do that. And then you write little adventure stories. And then when that's what I did. And then by the time in middle school, I was writing little stories, and by high school, I was really lucky. I had a teacher at high school, my freshman writing teacher, who used to, I don't know how it came about, but she would meet with me like extra, and I would workshop these little vignettes. She taught me that, where it was like, I don't know what these are, little short stories. It was like flash fiction. And nice. She would take time to sit with me and help me improve them and stuff. And so I took myself very seriously as a writer, and I was always going to be a writer after I graduated from college, which I didn't do. I kind of had a detour into academia, but since, as long as I can remember, after, first when I was little, I wanted to be an astronaut, which is ridiculous because I'm terrified of infinity. So that's a different story. And then I wanted to be an architect. And then I wanted to be an author for as long as I can remember.
Not Robert Scott?
I know. Well, I mean, I'm a little bit embarrassed, but I'm still going to say this. Every time I go out and do something in the snow or the cold, a little part of my brain is like, you are Robert Falcon Scott. You are an adventurer. I'm always pretending in some part of my brain. So, yeah.
That's amazing. It's such a sign of being a writer and being a creative in general, that there's like that part of your brain that's always processing that. That's
a kind way to put it. But yeah.
When you're writing, do you feel that same kind of like imagination, like you're in the character's shoes almost, or does it feel like something else?
I try to be. I like to think of it as a kind of acting, that you sort of, you get into the role, even when it's not first person narrative. You have to kind of get into the role and then think about, okay, in this situation, what's my character thinking or feeling or seeing or, all those things. So it is. And that's one of the reasons I like to write in the dark if I can, especially for writing those, 100 pages that became the Antarctica section of Terra Nova. I would come down at like 5 a.m. I would come downstairs, I'd make coffee, but I wouldn't turn any lights on. So I'd literally be like checking the level of the water in the French press using my phone flashlight.
Oh.
And then I would turn on this light that was just about as dim as could be over my notebook. And I would write longhand. And
it's so Emily Dickinson. I love it.
It worked for me. I really enjoyed it. And it was like keeping myself in this imaginary space. And because I was writing something that was so, these men could barely focus on anything more than 10 feet ahead of them, right? As they're pulling a sled behind them, or a sledge, as I say in the book. And yes, it's the Antarctic day, so everything around them was white and bright the whole time. But weirdly, everything around me was dark, and that kind of helped me pretend that I was just right there. And all I could see was like the tips of the skis.
Well, it's the same like limitless space. It makes sense that it would have that same feeling to it.
That does make sense. Yeah, that's right. And I don't know. I found the Viola sections harder to write, and there were more balls to juggle. She's in London. There are people. There are protests. It almost needed a wider open space. So, I'm gesturing like big wide gestures. I know this is a podcast, but like.
Well, I think that they'll be able to hear it. They'll understand.
Right. It's like it's wide, whereas the men was just this narrow focus. So I do think I moved to a different, like I actually sat at my desk when I was writing the Viola stuff. So
was it unique to this book that the writing was more, I'm going to say like more physical, but I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, like more setting based, or is that something that you've had with your other writing?
You mean the process of writing, or the writing, the outcome?
The process of writing.
Process. It was unique with this book. I still try to do it now. I learned that I really, really like that approach. It came about because I was a little bit skittish. I had written something that hadn't sold. And so I was like, I was nervous of beginning. And I had been hesitating to begin. And I finally thought, if you don't start this book like now, you're going to have a situation of sort of writer's block. And I don't even believe in writer's block, but I could feel that it was almost going to develop into a sort of, I can't write this book. Mm-hmm. So I told myself I had to change everything about the methods I was using to write, because I had been writing for many recent years. I've been writing on a laptop like a normal person, and I'd been writing with my lights on and during the day and at my desk. And so I said, no, you have to do everything different, and you have to just start. So dark, longhand, at the dining table. And it was, yes, deliberately a different mode for this book. And it's funny because I've tried to keep doing it, but I've never done it. That was like sustained 2-3 months. I kept doing it. Yeah. And I've never sustained it for that long. I do little spurts where I'm getting up at 5 and I'm doing the early morning thing. I wish I could sustain it, but there's something about, I don't know, it was something about that particular book that
is so fascinating. I love hearing that kind of background. I can imagine that would really get you into the heads of the characters or into the space, because at least in my experience, writing longhand is so tactile. It's perfect at getting like right into that zone.
Yeah, I really liked it, and I still write most of my first drafts. I write longhand, and I do love that. It's good for concentration too, because you're offline. Mm-hmm. You don't have to toggle focus on; it's always on, and it's just easy to take your stuff anywhere and write. And I do, but the physical connection is just, it is much more satisfying, and it does help me think more than typing on a laptop does.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you don't believe in writer's block. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, that sounds kind of obnoxious, but I
I
think
also don't believe in it, to clarify. I just think it's
okay.
interesting.
Well, I do think, I mean, yeah, there are days when it's really hard and there are days when you sit down and you can't come up with anything good. But the idea that you're like incapable of writing, I mean, surgeons don't have surgeon's block. Truck drivers don't have truck driver's block. They just do their job. And so I try to tell myself, maybe it does exist and I've just been fending it off because I keep whistling past that graveyard of saying like, no, you do not exist because I just will sit down and do my job. But, it's, I think that we know about, I think maybe there are beginning writers who feel as though they need to wait for the muse. And that's a dangerous row to hoe because you can wait a long time. And the muse, if there is one, it's like, I'm busy. I got something else to do. So we know that you can't wait for the inspiration, but you also shouldn't allow yourself to be blocked from inspiration because it isn't always inspiration. Sometimes it's just sit down and solve one little verbal problem at a time. Because that's what they are. We're solving problems using words. So every sentence we write is like 1,000 little problems that we have solved as we go. And you just, I'm a big believer I'm an athlete. And so I take a lot of lessons from sports. And whenever I'm stuck, I always look to sports for help. And so I think about that. You would not say, okay, I'm going to run a marathon and just do it from scratch. You would train little by little, little by little. So there might be writer's block if you said, tomorrow I'm going to write a novel. But you don't do that. You write a sentence and another sentence and another sentence. And so that's my thought on writer's block.
I 1000% agree with you. That was so well said. And I know that I've had days where I sit down to write and I can write for like hours, and the entire time I'm thinking, I hate this. I have no inspiration. This is terrible. And then the next day I look back and it was perfectly fine.
Yeah, perfect.
And I'll be happy I wrote because it was practice.
Right. And sometimes perfectly fine is great because you can always revise. This is what sort of I tell my students, like in a really good way. For most people writing most of the time, the stakes are really low. I mean, sure, there are people whose life and livelihood depends on their writing, and we're not even talking about political writing and things like that. Absolutely, there are people for whom the stakes are very, very, very high. But for most of us writing fiction, the stakes are low, which is very liberating because you can try stuff, you can change stuff, you can experiment. You can feel as though you're not inspired, but just write anyway. And if a week later you're going back to that section and you say, oh goodness, that was bad, you can fix it. So that sort of encourages me. And it encourages me to keep plowing forward when even sometimes it's like not working right.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Thank you for that advice. Did you have any other pieces of advice for any aspiring writers that could be listening to this?
I think it's all about creating positive feedback loops for yourself. Because I say this a lot, but like the only reward from writing that you can guarantee is your enjoyment in the process. That part you can guarantee. The rest is out of your hands, unfortunately, because it's a publishing industry with gatekeepers, and so it's out of your hands. But so write in a way that you enjoy, and also make sure that you kind of remind yourself that you're having a good time. And even on a day when it doesn't go well, pick one thing that you did well, and like fist pump, like give yourself the props that I did this one thing well. Don't get down in the dumps because, I was terrible today. I can never go back to writing ever again. I'm horrible and I should quit right now. Because we all feel that.
I've been guilty of that many times.
Yeah. I'm feeling it right now. Like, oh my God, everybody should go home. Don't come to my book launch. This book is terrible.
It's
amazing. But because we do feel that, but like you have to hold out the one thing. And then the next day when you sit down, you'll be like, oh, it's okay because I did that one good thing yesterday. So I'm all right. And you keep creating that positive feedback loop that keeps you in it, keeps you going.
That is incredible. Thank you so much. And thank you for being on this show. This was so great to chat with you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was great to talk with you.
Thank you. I just have one last question. What do you have coming up?
Oh, well, I'm working on another novel I am working on it. That's about a physicist in 1972, young woman physicist, and her mother who disappeared when the physicist, was 10.
Ooh.
So it's sort of about fusion and the Manhattan Project and a cold case kind of thing.
Congratulations. Good luck with the writing of that, and for the book launch for Terra Nova and for everything happening there.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much for being on.
And you're very welcome, and thank you for having me. This is great. I really enjoyed talking to you, Molly.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Henriette Lazaridis.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after, the end.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.